Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Everyday Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Green. This is a podcast where we remind ourselves that God deserves every praise from every creature every day. This is episode number 8 of the current season. We have been discussing the book of Ecclesiastes. I hope that you're bearing with me. Last week, again, we did have some pretty rough things that Solomon had to say in the beginning of chapter 4. But again, as I've said repeatedly now, understand that Solomon is giving us a glimpse into how he felt before he realized the end of what he has to say in chapter 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And so Solomon realizes that at the end of his life, probably, but he's giving us a glimpse right now. As we're studying through Ecclesiastes, he's giving us a glimpse of how things were before he realized that. So he was in really the depths of despair, trying to find happiness, and he couldn't find it. So he's telling us about that here. And it can be kind of depressing to read through at first, but don't forget the end, chapter 12, and that'll help you through this book. Again, this is a wonderful book, but only if we have the proper Christian perspective will it help us to see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So we're in chapter 4, and we're picking up in verse number 4, and we're talking about this week the failure of living for self, the failure of living for self to bring happiness. So we'll go ahead and begin reading in verse number 4. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity, and grasping for the wind. The fool, verse 5, folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Verse 6, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Then I returned, and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity, and a grave misfortune. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king, who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So the thought processes continue. Again, if we are not focused on what really matters in life, fearing God and keeping his commandments, this might sound depressing. But if we fear God and keep his commandments, then we won't have the attitude that Solomon is telling us he had at one point in his life here. So let's go ahead and start with verse number 4. And I call this the keeping up with the Jones effect. We're all familiar with that, hopefully. Verse number 4 says, again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Keeping up with the Jones. Is it not the case that this phenomenon, as we call it, is usually what happens is you might have some neighbors, and let's say that one neighbor has a fancy new add-on to his house, and so now the neighbor would be the Jones, right? And so now the next homeowner over and perhaps all the homeowners on the street, they want to have a fancy new add-on to their house as well. And so we can have that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. So the tendency of many to be jealous of what others have gained through their hard work, that would be covetousness. There are two sins surrounding materialistic thought processes. Number one, idolatry in general, that is the essentially worshiping of stuff. We need to be careful not to worship our material belongings. Number two, covetousness, which would be sinfully desiring other people's stuff, which, by the way, also happens to be a form of idolatry. Colossians 3, verse 5. Solomon says that this struggle between people and their stuff, when we try to keep up with the Joneses, it's all just vanity and grasping for the wind. Verse number 5, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. So verse 5 and verse 6 as well, these are verses about contentment. Verse 5 is kind of tricky, but basically Solomon is saying that a slothful fool, he folds his hands and he doesn't get any work done, we might say, thereby consuming his own flesh because he ends up not getting to eat because of his laziness. Think about the fable of the ant and the grasshopper. This is an old fable that many of us have heard of, and the ant worked diligently throughout the spring and summer to gather his food and to bring them into the storehouse, and he harvested a lot. Meanwhile, the grasshopper just sang the days away, and he did not work. And so when winter came, the ant had everything he needed and then some, and the grasshopper had nothing. And so he was in the bitter cold, freezing to death, and hungry on top of that. And he goes to the ant's house, and he knocks on the door, and he begs, please help me. I need help. And the ant mercifully says, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll help you this time, but next year you better work with me to be able to provide for yourself. So that's an old fable that teaches the same concept here. Again, Solomon says, the fool folds his hands in laziness, we might say, and consumes his own flesh in the process. Verse number 6, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. So if verse 5 is laziness and not having enough, verse 6 would be the opposite of that, and that would be someone who is working himself to death, and he's got a lot, but he has no peace in his life, no time to even enjoy the fruits of his labor. So I think that's what verse 6 is talking about. Proverb 30, verses 7 through 9, is a parallel passage here. I love this, and it really teaches the importance of contentment. Proverbs 30, verses 7 through 9, it says, 2 things I request of you, deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies far from me. And then he says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you. And so that would be, if he's got a lot, an excess of stuff, we might say, to the point that he denies God and says, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor, not having enough, and steal and profane the name of my God. So basically what Solomon is saying there in Proverbs 30 is that he wants to be content. He wants to have enough, but enough to be comfortable, but not too much or too little. And that's a good policy. Godliness with contentment is great gain. We read about in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Verse number 7 here in Ecclesiastes 4. Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. So more of the same. This is the same thing that Solomon's been noticing in this book. Vanity under the sun. That is vanity in this life down here, if it is a life not lived properly in accordance with God's will. Verse number 8. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother. Yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. So what's going on here in verse number 8? Solomon says that there are some people who live life alone. They don't have family to provide for, which would lend itself to the proper accumulation of wealth. And Proverb 13, verse 22 talks about how a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And so that would be the proper use of wealth and providing an inheritance for children and grandchildren. Nothing wrong with that biblically. And yet, Solomon says there exists such a one who doesn't have any family to provide an inheritance for, but he still works his life away in the vanity of trying to accumulate wealth and stuff. You almost get the idea of an Ebenezer Scrooge type character here, who is figuratively or maybe even literally swimming in piles of gold for himself, and yet he's miserable. He is a Scrooge. He is one who is miserly, and we could go on. That's the idea here that Solomon is saying, look, there are people who worship their stuff, their money, their belongings, etc., so much, and they don't even realize the foolishness of it all in the sense that they can't even leave that stuff to a family member. Of course, we realize and hopefully know this, that there is no such thing as a hearse with a luggage rack or a hearse with a U-Haul trailer behind it. We can't carry our stuff with us when we die. We can leave inheritances, and that's a good thing, but Solomon points out the folly here of somebody who is obsessing over accumulating more, and he's not even going to have anybody to leave it to when he dies. And so he says this also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Solomon is really getting to the heart of the matter when it comes to avoiding materialism, isn't he? We need to remember that. Again, we're talking about the idea of the failure of living for self to provide lasting happiness. And unfortunately, I think materialism is a very, very, very common sin today. Verse number 9. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. Speaking of one who is alone without companion, as we saw in verse number 8, 2 are better than 1. And so having a companion is better for life. And I think the next few verses are going to indicate how. Verse number 10, for if they fall, that is, if 2 fall, 1 will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Lots of application here for the accountability system that God has given us and has incorporated into the design of his church. The church is an accountability system, and so we can rely on our brothers and sisters in Christ to help us up when we fall. Sometimes we're the one that falls, and we need helping up, and sometimes our brother or our sister is the one that falls, and we need to be there to help him or her up as well. Verse number 11 says, again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? How many survival stories have you heard of, or maybe you watch some of these survival shows, and they include the fact that people had to huddle together in a snowstorm in order to keep warm. It works, doesn't it? You have 2 or 3 people or several that are huddling together, perhaps in a cave somewhere to try to get out of the elements, and they can stay warm that way much better than one person alone. So I think that we readily recognize this principle of verse 11 here. And then verse 12 says, though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. So this is kind of a combative type situation, a fight. And one person alone, there's not as much protection there versus the strength that you can have in numbers. Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. Also, a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. And that's in reference to a rope. 3 strands is a lot better than 1 or 2. And so strength in numbers, and we need to remember that when it comes to the church as well. We're stronger together. If we will stay together, unified in the church, it will help us to fight our enemy, which is, of course, Satan. Verse number 13, better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. Verse 14 goes with that, for he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. Do you think that Solomon is perhaps inserting himself and his bad choices here when he talks about a poor and wise youth and how that's better than an old foolish king? I wonder if Solomon's calling himself the old foolish king here. I can't help but think that. And so basically, I think Solomon is saying that a poor young person is better off, even if he remains in that poor state. He's better off if he's wise compared to a rich old king and noble by birth, but he is foolish. Solomon says that a poor and young person is greater than an old, rich, noble, but foolish person. Then finally, verses 15 and 16. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. There's some difficulty in interpretation of the words of these two verses. Seems to be lost in translation a little bit, but I think the overarching point is that Solomon seems to be referencing the fact that many a youth have been born into his kingdom. He's the old foolish king that reigns over them, and even though he has it all, so to speak, as far as material desires are concerned, and they don't have much because they're just poor citizens of his kingdom, yet he still pities himself and longs for the simpler life that they have, in recognition of the fact that, again, what we saw in the verses 13 and 14, a young but wise person is better off than a rich old fool, as Solomon evidently sees himself in these verses. He says, surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind, emptiness, pointlessness, and grasping for the wind that you cannot catch. So that's chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes. Again, Solomon is telling us how it felt to search for happiness in all the wrong places. I hope that as you're listening to this, and the younger we figure this out, the better, I hope that you realize the point of life. Again, chapter 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. Then he says in verse 14, for God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. The sooner we figure that out, the better. And so in keeping with this theme for this season of the podcast, let us fear God and keep his commandments. I hope that you'll tune in next week as we continue this study of Ecclesiastes.